It was a surprising confession from Donald Trump in an interview published this week with Time magazine. Asked about prices, he said, quote, "It's hard to bring things down once they're up." And Trump isn't wrong about that, but it's also something he campaigned on, bringing prices down, and slammed President Biden over. If those prices don't come down, some voters may be very disappointed. CNN senior political analyst Ron Brownstein is joining us now. And Ron, we know the economy and the cost of living was a very top of mind issue for so many voters. And if Trump can't get those prices down, what happens then?
Above all, this was the job that voters hired him to do. I mean, if you look at the exit polls, you look at the VoteCast survey, there were a lot of voters who voted for him, but still had a lot of reservations about him. I mean, 1/4 of the people who voted for him said he was too extreme. 1/6 of the people who voted for him said they worried he would steer the country in an authoritarian direction. But they voted for him anyway because they thought he was better on the economy. They thought he would get their economic situation more stabilized. And of course, the irony here, the paradox here is that pretty much every major economist or Wall Street investment firm that looked at Trump's agenda raised the concern that the key elements of what he's talking about, in particular, the across-the-board tariffs and mass deportation, were much more likely to raise prices than lower them. So I think this is the yardstick above all that voters are going to be judging Trump on. Do they feel like their cost of living is more manageable over the next 2 years than it has been over the last few?
Yeah, no doubt about it. And you have your latest piece in The Atlantic that's titled "Trump is about to betray his rural supporters." You write that the policies that he's pushing could conflict with what's best for those voters. Walk us through that.
Yeah, look, I mean, Trump's support in rural America seems to have no, meaningful ceiling. I mean, he approached 70% of the vote in the most rural counties, 60% of the vote in small metros, even more than he won in 2016. But when you look at the specifics of his policy agenda, there is a lot in there that put rural communities at risk. In the first term, the biggest losers from Trump's tariffs were agricultural interests. He ultimately had to spend more than $60 billion in public money to try to basically buy peace in rural communities after foreign nations retaliated against American agricultural products in response to Trump's tariffs. He's now proposing even bigger tariffs. Mass deportation, the estimates from the Peterson Institute for International Economics is that would reduce the workforce in ag communities more than in any other industry. Medicaid is especially important in rural communities to rural hospitals. Fewer people in rural areas have private health insurance, and thus they are more at risk from the cuts that Trump and Republicans have been talking about in Medicaid. By the way, in particular, treatment for the opioid epidemic is especially reliant on Medicaid in rural areas. And that is something Trump has pledged to prioritize. And finally, if Trump has repeatedly said, most recently when he announced his appointment for his nominee for education secretary, he wants to pursue a universal voucher system. We have seen in state after state rural voters oppose school voucher plans, for example, in Kentucky and Nebraska this year, because they recognize that rural schools have even less margin for error if they lose people than urban schools. By the way, since I wrote that, Jessica, today, the Washington Post reported on a fifth major policy area that could disproportionately hurt rural communities, which is the idea of privatizing the postal service. It is the provider, the deliverer of last resort in a lot of remote places in the U.S., and a privatization plan would probably have a disproportionate impact on the economies of rural. So you add it all up, there are a lot of places where the interests of rural communities may collide with their ideological sympathy or convergence with Trump.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. And I keep going back to the school thing because for so many people in rural areas, the school is really the center of the community. I think about like Friday night football games. It's where people watch everyone's kids grow up and then their kids go there. I mean, that's really important to the soul of these towns and these areas.
In Kentucky this year, the ballot initiative on school vouchers lost in every county, including the most red rural counties that voted overwhelmingly for Trump, precisely for the reasons that you cite. I mean, I talked to the person who ran that campaign, and she said, every community understands what an anchor really for their kind of stability of their communities. The local school provides the same thing with rural hospitals. 190 rural hospitals have closed in the past 2 decades, and cuts in Medicaid anywhere along the lines of what Republicans in the House have proposed, and that Trump in his first term proposed to block grant and cut Medicaid. Rural hospitals would disproportionately bear the brunt of that. And as I say, look, there is a lot of ideological sympathy for kind of Trump's view of the world, the idea that coastal elites are kind of getting fat and looking down on you and being favored, and cultural and demographic change is kind of marginalizing these smaller, rural, predominantly white in most cases, communities. So there's a lot of ideological affinity for Trump and Trumpism, but to a greater extent than his first term, I think. If he can implement the agenda he ran on, that ideological sympathy will collide with real threats to the material interests of these rural communities. And if he can implement the agenda that he ran on, I think it will test whether anything can loosen or reverse the trend of these smaller places toward the GOP in the Trump era, which has been very powerful the last 10 years.
It'll be very interesting to see. All right, Ron Brownstein, as always, good to see you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.